Chapter 54. The Great Muta. In January 1989, Dusty Rhodes was replaced by George Scott, and the first wrestler that George recruited was former WWF champion, the Iron Sheik. Jim Hart dutifully signed him up for a 2-year contract at $300,000 per year, and his contract specifically stated that he had to be notified 3 months in advance if he was going to be let go. Well, Jim Hart forgot about that clause, and decided to fire the Iron Sheik about 2 months into his arrival with no notice. Because of that careless oversight, the Iron Sheik ended up making $600,000 from the NWA, and probably wrestled a total of 50 matches for the company. That shows you a little of the incompetence of Jim Hart. He should have known what his contractual obligations were to the wrestlers, but he didn't know anything about talent negotiation. Jim Hart was a moron. George Scott also brought Abdullah the Butcher in, and asked me to look after his business. Abby and I had that as a long-standing practice, anyway, because we were an old established firm and the fans knew us as a team. As soon as Abdullah arrived, George booked him in a match against Dick Murdoch at the upcoming Clash of the Champions. Since the clash was going to be in New Orleans, Jim Hart wanted Abdullah to come to the ring with a marching band playing gospel-like funeral music. Now anyone with common sense knows that there's a big difference in the mood that gospel-like music creates, and what Butchie's persona as the Wildman from Sudan was. Therefore, Abdullah refused. That's when Butchie was fired. To replace Abdullah for the show, I brought in my old buddy Bob Orton to wrestle Dick Murdoch at the Clash. That night Dory Funk, Terry Funk, Gene Kinniski, Pat O'Connor, Buddy Rogers, and Lou Thez were in attendance. It was a tribute to the NWA, and was a rare moment of brilliance from Jim Hart. That to me was a very exciting night, because it showed that the NWA had a rich history, even though we were now a part of Ted Turner's company, and was the lone bright spot in Jim Hart's whole tenure with the company. Of course, after bringing in all of those former world champions, some of whom went back to the 1940s, the announcers never mentioned another word about the NWA, and eventually dropped it in favor of WCW. That right there shows the corporate mentality slowly creeping into the company. It was great to be back with Bob Orton, though. He would bring his young son Randy on the road with him, and since Randy is the same age as my boys, I would bring them, and they would all play and go swimming in the hotel pools together. After his match with Dick Murdoch at the Clash, Bob and Dick were put into a lengthy program together that culminated with a bull rope match at the WrestleWar pay-per-view from Nashville, Tennessee. I really enjoyed that program with Dick, because he was such a wonderful guy. Everyone loved Dick Murdoch, and anytime anyone saw him, they got a big smile on their face. He always had a story to tell, and he loved wrestling with a passion like few guys I've ever known in my life. Dick Murdoch was the same way from the day I met him in 1966 until the day he died in 1996. A big, happy-go-lucky guy who enjoyed every moment of his life. He was a great friend of mine. Dick and Bob did well together in their feud. They were two good friends doing what they wanted to do, and making a good living doing it. And even though they weren't in the main event, they always had a good, solid match. Guys like Dick, Bob, and I never minded being the support act. As long as we were packing the buildings, we were pleased to be on the undercard. We weren't like Sting and Lex Luger, who felt that without them, the NWA would die. We understood it was the whole card, and realized that we were just a part of something bigger than us, and that we weren't the most important thing. Bob, Dick, and I understood what it took to make money. In the end, Jim Hart really stuck it to Bob big time, and fired him with no just cause. Plus, since Jim had no idea who Bob Orton was, he let him go like he was a nobody. Bob gave everything he had to the NWA. He brought his fame from the WWF, which was considerable, and when it came to in-ring work, no one was better than Bob Orton. He was super cooperative and dependable in every way, and what did he get in return? Mistreated. One day, George Scott pulled me aside and asked if I could develop another Great Kabuki. I told him that while I couldn't recreate the Great Kabuki, I could make something similar. What I actually ended up creating was the son of the Great Kabuki. However, I wanted to present him in a less scary manner than I had with his father. I wanted to present this new character like he was a superhero that happened to be managed by a very bad guy, much like I did with the Spoiler and the Dingo Warrior. There was a Japanese wrestler I saw at the very end of World Class named Keiji Mutoh. He had been in the business for 5 years and was in America wrestling as the White Ninja, but had never really gotten any opportunity. Although I had never met him and just saw him on TV, I saw something in him, and decided that he would be the one. I knew that Hiro Matsuda could get me in touch with him, because he was the one who got the working papers and visas for the Japanese talent in America. When I called Hiro and told him I was interested in Keiji Mutoh, he wasted no time in getting me in touch with him, because of my past successes with Pak Song and the Great Kabuki. Hiro even called up Keiji and told him that this was his big opportunity. When I first met Keiji, I liked his name and decided to use it, changing it ever so slightly to the Fabulous Muta. However, I quickly realized that it sounded too similar to the Fabulous Moolah, so I switched it to the Great Muta. I had such a passion when I was developing the Great Muta that all of my concentration, focus, and thoughts went into his creation, as well as to figuring out how best to present him. In 1989, the Great Muta was my sole priority, and I spent a lot of time perfecting him. Because I was still developing the Great Muta, I didn't want him to appear in big towns or on TV before he was ready. Therefore, I got him booked in small towns throughout the Carolinas so we could perfect his character. I also had him watch tapes of the Great Kabuki, and explained to him that although I didn't want him to be like the Great Kabuki, I wanted him to be similar. For example, the Great Muta wouldn't do nunchuck demonstrations or use the samurai sword like the Great Kabuki did, nor would he wear the multicolored outfits. The only similarity the two of them would have would be the green mist, the ability to switch from wrestling to martial arts, and the painting of the face. However, I wanted the Great Muta to paint his face in an attractive way, and not in a scary, ugly way. Most importantly, however, was that I didn't want the Great Muta to be the vicious, mean, assassin-type wrestler like the Great Kabuki was. I didn't even want to try and duplicate that. The Great Muta was going to be someone that children could enjoy. I have to say that Keiji took to the Great Muta character like a fish to water, and he really captured what I was looking for. He was also a terrific person, and I really enjoyed his company. My two boys adored him, as well, because he would get them video games from Japan and hang out with them. He truly became part of our family, and some of my son's greatest memories are of spending time with me and the Great Muta. Over time, the Great Muta became a good likeness of what the Great Kabuki's son would have been. When the time was right for him to debut on television, my biggest fear was that the fans would think I was repeating myself and simply trying to make another Great Kabuki. Fortunately, they never did, because I carefully presented the Great Muta in a way that was totally unlike his father. Plus, I waited long enough before I casually mentioned his father, the Great Kabuki. As soon as I said that, the announcer Jim Ross was great, and jumped in with, "It's the Great Kabuki's son." I knew it. Once people found out that he was the son of the Great Kabuki, anyone who ever saw the Great Kabuki wanted to see his son, and when they saw him they were awestruck. Because I was very careful in not presenting him as just a duplicate of the Great Kabuki, I was very pleased that he was becoming a fan favorite, rather than a hated heel like his father. He was especially cheered in cities like Philadelphia, Landover, and Baltimore. Those fans know what they like in wrestling, and the Great Muta was definitely someone they liked. And just 3 months after being hired, George Scott was let go. It appeared that the wrestling business had passed him by. After his brief stint in World Class, he spent most of his time with real estate and golf, and had gotten uninvolved in wrestling. And when he came to the NWA, he had been out of the loop for so long that he lost his connection to what makes people buy tickets. He also didn't have a feel for what was happening in 1989, with the changes in TV production and 30-man cards. For the first time in his life, George Scott was in over his head. However, it's also a possibility that George got back involved, and after realizing how much time it took, and how much dedication was required to do the job effectively, he decided it wasn't worth the struggle. In any event, once George Scott left, it was over. He represented the last semblance of any sort of sanity, because after that, Jim Hart instituted an absurd concept, the booking committee. During its existence, the booking committee consisted of Ole Anderson, Jim Barnett, Jim Cornette, Ric Flair, Eddie Gilbert, Jim Hart, Jim Ross, and Kevin Sullivan. One night in St. Louis, Missouri, Ric Flair and Sam Muchnick took me up to the third-floor dressing room and asked me if I would like to be a part of the committee. "Not really. I'm not interested," I told them. "I don't want to sit around a table, throw out ideas, and compete with other people to get mine through. I also don't want to spend time coming up with an idea that I think could draw money, but by the time it makes it to the air, it's nothing like my original idea." I was blunt with them, but that's my style. If you ask me something important, I'll give you my answer, and explain why I feel that way. Another reason I could not become part of their committee was because I didn't trust their judgment. The only ones on that committee who had a clue as to what should go on was Ole Anderson and Jim Barnett, but Jim was getting old and just wanted to enjoy his final years with as little aggravation as possible, and Ole was not willing to fight another war. He was just content in getting his salary. Plus, half of the committee made a living from actually wrestling in the ring, so they brought their own agendas to the table. If Jim Hart wanted to interview me for the booking job, and check my past accomplishments as booker in Florida, Georgia, Texas, and North Carolina, that would have been fine. I had tenure of 14 years as a booker and was very successful in every area I ever went to. I had developed and created many guys that are household names to this very day. I would have taken the booking job, but I wouldn't take a job to sit in a room with a lot of other people, because I knew that nothing creative can come from a committee. And don't get me wrong, I had worked alongside other bookers before, Dory Funk, Wahoo McDaniel, and Ernie Ladd in the Carolinas to be specific, but Jimmy Crockett was smart enough to give us individual states that we were responsible for. That way, we wouldn't be fighting each other for angles and would just pitch ideas for the group of guys we had. The booking committee concept reminded me of the old saying, too many cooks in the kitchen, and I knew that there was a reason that saying had been around for a long time. Yes, I'm stubborn, set in my ways, and have strong opinions, but I made everyone that I was ever with money. With all that said, I should also add that I was the furthest thing in Jim Hurt's mind as to what a booker should be. The great Muta was booked in a series of matches with Eddie Gilbert. Eddie was an excellent worker, but he was also on the booking committee, and the committee didn't want Eddie to lose. That was fine, and I accepted that. There were lots of times I didn't want my guys beat. So one night in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, it was suggested that the great Muta blow Eddie with the green mist for a disqualification. I didn't mind using the mist ceremonially before the match where it's blown into the air, but I didn't want to use it for a disqualification, because after a while, it loses its effectiveness. However, the committee insisted on the green, so that's what they got. We used to pack a condom the size of a pinky tip with green mist, but this time I told the great Muta to make one the size of a thumb. The match was set up so that Eddie's wife and valet, Missy Hyatt, would jump on the apron during the match, so I instructed the great Muta, when you see Missy on the ring apron, hit Eddie with your super kick, then turn and blow Missy green. Missy was in a very skimpy outfit that day, and when the great Muta turned and blew Missy, it was a sight. Not knowing she was going to get hit with it, all of the emotions that you would want a person to deliver, we got. She was mad, angry, screaming, and hollering. It was magnificent. As I came back through the curtain after the match, the entire booking committee was standing there furious with me. They wanted green, they got green. The booking committee got their revenge when they told me that every time the great Muta and Eddie would wrestle, Missy would come running from the back with a kendo stick to chase me away from the ring. Now it was meaningless and senseless for her to carry a kendo stick, because the great Muta never carried one. They were clearly confusing him with the great Kabuki. So when they told me that, I simply replied, Gary Hart doesn't run from a lady. They insisted that this had to happen, so I suggested, why don't you do it with Paul Heyman? He'll do anything as long as you give him TV time. And even though it made absolutely no sense whatsoever, that's exactly what they did. By the way, my refusal to partake in that silly angle had nothing to do with Missy Hyatt. I knew Missy from World Class when she was with John Tatum, and I always found her to be very sweet. The great Muta was then programmed in a long feud with Sting, which included a match at the Great American Bash in Baltimore, Maryland. For one of their matches at an outside show in Florence, South Carolina, I had my children with me. It was a really hot crowd that night, so just before our match, I told Sting I didn't want to get involved, because I didn't want to have any problems later that night with my children across the street at the Cadillac Motel. Of course, during the match, Sting took a few swipes at me. I yelled at him to leave me alone, but he shot back, "You think you're too good to work with us, huh?" It was in the process of their match, so I dropped it. But I was really angry. The heels and babyfaces had separate dressing rooms, so after the match I went to the back and told referee Nick Patrick, "You tell Sting I want to see him right now, and if he doesn't get over here in 5 minutes, I'm coming to get him." I waited a few minutes, and then in walked Sting. "What do you want?" he asked. "Ever since I've been here, first with Al Perez, and now with the great Muta, we've gone out there every night and made you look like $1 million, I told him. "We've done everything in our power to keep you over and take care of you, and you've done everything in your power to kill us off. Then you make a remark like that out there to me? What's the matter with you? If you weren't so old," Sting sneered, "I would kick your ass right now." "Don't let my age bother you, but just remember, I fight back," I replied. "So before you mess with me, go talk to people like Michael Hayes and Ric Flair and find out who you're messing with, and you'll realize that I'm giving you a pass by letting you walk out of this room in one piece." He apparently did speak with Michael and Rick, because after that I was Mr. Hart to him. One night he had bought a pair of brand new yellow tights and white boots, and he had the gall to ask me if the great Muta wouldn't blow him green because he didn't want to get his new clothes messed up, while he was standing there with his face painted up. Boy, did I make sure that the great Muta blew him green that night. I never took Sting seriously, though. He was rude to fans, and had an ego the size of the world. One of his things was to walk through the airport and imitate and make fun of retarded people, and he was a fan favorite. It was embarrassing. I don't know how he is now. I hear that he's a changed man, and I hope he is. As I mentioned earlier, by the way I designed it, the Great Muta was extremely popular with the fans, and a lot of times during his matches against Sting, the people would chant MUTA. MUTA. As pleased as I was, that drove Sting nuts, and he whined about it so much that the booking committee started getting on me because the Great Muta wasn't being received as a heel. They constantly threw that in my face. I actually had to point out to them, what's the difference if they love him or hate him? If the Great Muta is entertaining the people, putting butts in the seats, and helping the television ratings, shouldn't we all be thrilled? Unfortunately, the booking committee couldn't wrap their collective heads around that concept, and felt that if I managed someone he had to be a heel. They had a certain mindset and couldn't think outside that box. That's when the booking committee came up with an idea to create two Great Mutas, a good Muta and a bad Muta. They wanted to get another Japanese wrestler who looked identical to the Great Muta, which would have been very difficult because Keiji is 6'2", and there aren't many 6'2" Japanese wrestlers around. Make them tag team partners, and then have them feud. Jim Barnett, Jim Ross, and Jim Hart pulled me aside one day with that doozy. They were busy looking for another great kabuki while I was satisfied and focused on what we had, the Great Muta. So no matter what they insisted, I was not about to make the Great Muta a vicious heel just to please the committee and Sting, because it would piss off the fans, and would be ridiculous to make him what the people clearly didn't want him to be. And since everything was black and white with the booking committee, they felt that since the Great Muta was being received as a babyface, I should stop managing him that very instant. First of all, the Great Muta wasn't the first guy that I had managed that people liked. Before him, the fans managed to fall in love with men like the Spoiler and the Great Kabuki. Remember the stories I shared about Christmas Night 1968 and the 1984 David Von Erich Memorial? The fans also loved Dusty Rhodes, Bruiser Brody, and the Dingo Warrior on a nightly basis, in spite of the fact that I was their manager. The fans loved each and every one of them, but I continued to manage them and develop their careers, standing by their side every night. And when the time was right, I didn't hesitate to turn all of them babyface. I never refused doing it when the time was right, and when it was in the best interest of all parties concerned. I also knew that when the time was right, the Great Muta and I would split up, and he would embark on a great babyface run. I would be a fool not to do that. At that moment though, I had one obligation and one obligation only, to take care of the Great Muta's career. George Scott asked me to develop a kabuki-like gimmick. I found Keiji Mutoh, and was in the process of building him into a marquee name around the world. The Great Muta had only been with me for 3 months, and was just grasping what we were creating. I knew that it was going to take him a while to realize who he was and what we were doing, and at that point in time, he clearly wasn't ready to be on his own. Yes, he was a great worker, but he was still coming to me during his matches for instructions. I had to make him understand that he was no longer the White Ninja, he was the Great Muta, and he had value. It may sound strange to you, but for a lot of guys, especially those who had worked underneath for a long time, once someone plucks them out of the opening matches, and decides to give them a push, it's very hard for them to understand who they are becoming, or who they had already become. It's a very difficult thing to take a young guy and mold him and develop him into who I know he can be, and just because he was over at that moment doesn't mean that he would stay over. Developing someone's career is sort of like painting a picture on a blank canvas. I have an idea in my head where I'm going, but I don't really know what it will look like until it's through. Once I know I'm finished, I'll let the gimmick morph into whatever the fans want it to be, and then turn my attention to developing someone else. And if you think I'm taking too much credit for the Great Muta's success, do some research and see how long Keiji Mutoh had been doing second and third matches before I took him under my wing and made him a sensation. Then ask yourself, why wasn't he a sensation before? So as I was in the midst of developing the Great Muta, the booking committee was desperate to break us up. All those learned men, didn't they know that Rome wasn't built in a day?